a thrift store medal, and a mop. That's all they saw when he collapsed in that hallway. Just some janitor with bad timing. That's what one of the paramedics muttered as they zipped Royce Whitaker into the stretcher, the last echoes of gunfire still fading down the corridors of the town's community center. Blood on his shirt, one arm limp from the shot he took shielding those two screaming kids in the break room. And the medal, the one everyone said was fake, pressed tight against his chest under that old denim jacket. He'd fallen hard, but not before stopping a man with a loaded pistol, disarming him barehanded, and keeping half the crowd from becoming headlines. But Royce never opened his mouth to explain, not even as they wheeled him away. It wasn't until later, when they removed the jacket to stop the bleeding, that they found the hidden interior pocket, a folded letter from 1985 signed by a U.S. Army general, two faded commendation slips, and a bronze star, dulled but unmistakably real. And that's when everything changed. If you agree that real honor doesn't need to shout, it just shows up, like and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. Now, rewind 7 days. The community center was buzzing for the annual Veterans Appreciation Week, and Royce, who most folks didn't even know by name, was busy tightening screws in the folding chairs and wiping down vending machines that didn't belong to him. 68 years old, sharp-jawed and narrow-eyed, he moved slow but steady, with the posture of a man who still calculated every doorway. He never talked about the medal, the one stitched into the lining of his jacket like a secret, and he sure never bragged. Most of the town's younger staff had already written him off. "Old man with a fake medal and too much free time," said Bryce Connors, a part-time security guard who wore tactical gloves indoors and thought watching boot camp videos on YouTube made him battlefield ready. Royce never responded, just gave that same dry half-smile he used for broken faucets and bad coffee. Bryce would laugh and say, "He probably bought it online. Ain't no soldier carries himself that soft." It didn't matter how many tables Royce fixed or how often he beat everyone to the center by 6 a.m. sharp. The stories always stuck harder than the truth. And truth be told, Royce never corrected them. He just showed up, patched things, made mental notes about emergency exits, loose panels, and the timing on the security cameras. Lena Martinez, the new outreach coordinator, noticed. She was the only one who ever asked, "Were you ever, military?" Royce had looked at her a long time, then said softly, "Just a mechanic, really." She knew there was more, but never pushed. She'd see him counting seconds under his breath while watching how long the side doors took to close. She once caught him tracing a faded map of the building in a notebook, timing how long it would take to walk from the kitchen to the rear exit. She thought it was odd, until it wasn't. On the day of the event, the center was filled to capacity. Veterans in wheelchairs, retired colonels in clean dress blues, even a few local news reporters. Royce kept mostly to the back, adjusting microphone cables and checking the rear latch by the gym entrance for the third time that morning. Bryce caught him doing it and laughed. "Paranoid much?" "This isn't Fallujah, Grandpa." Royce didn't answer. Instead, he just looked at the exposed cable tray overhead, then the back corridor with its busted light, and made another note. He could feel something in his bones, that old weight, the same kind he hadn't felt since Kandahar, and he moved slower that day, more deliberate. Lena noticed it. She even asked him, "You okay?" And Royce just replied, "Too many people in one place. Always makes my shoulder itch." She thought it was a joke. It wasn't. At 3:14 p.m., just as the town mayor raised her voice for the third time during a speech about service and sacrifice, the back door slammed open. A man burst in, yelling nonsense, wild-eyed, armed. Not a prank, not a drill. Bryce froze. No one moved. Royce didn't hesitate. He was already behind the second partition wall by the time the man's hand reached inside his coat. Two kids screamed. The crowd panicked. The man pulled a gun, and Royce, 68, half-limp, and just a janitor, sprinted, tackled him from the side, and used his entire body like a shield. One shot went off. It struck Royce through the shoulder and slammed him against the vending machine. But he didn't go down. He took the gun, ejected the mag, and locked the slide in one swift motion. When the cops arrived, he was sitting on the shooter's back with one hand clamped around the man's wrist and the other still gripping the empty weapon. Blood down his arm. Jacket torn. Bryce cried in the corner. Everyone stood stunned. Royce simply stood up, walked over to the wall, and slumped against it like he was just tired, not hurt. Not scared, just done. EMTs said he was lucky. Others called him crazy. Some didn't say anything at all. But it wasn't until they opened his jacket and saw what was inside that everything finally changed. The Bronze Star, the combat citation, the faded letter that read, "To Sergeant Royce Whitaker, for actions above and beyond in Operation Sandwatch," signed by a general whose name still opened doors at the Pentagon. The whispers stopped. The laughter went silent. Because the man they said wore a fake medal was the one who'd just shielded them all. It wasn't until the footage hit local news that people started saying his name like it meant something. Royce Whitaker. Not the janitor, not that guy with the fake medal, but Royce, the man who shielded a pair of children with his body and disarmed an active shooter in under 7 seconds. At first, the coverage was awkward, clumsy, like they didn't know how to frame a story that challenged everything they'd just assumed last week. Bryce, the security guard who once laughed loudest, stood stiff in a local interview and mumbled something about how you never really know someone's background, as if that excused the way he used to mock Royce's limp and whisper stolen valor under his breath. Lena, meanwhile, sat in Royce's hospital room, flipping gently through the old letter from the general, tracing the pen strokes like they could somehow explain what kind of man sits alone for 30 years with honor pressed between jacket seams and never once asks to be seen. Royce didn't say much. The morphine dulled his voice, and the pain in his shoulder came in waves. But his eyes stayed sharp, like he was still scanning exits. "You ever gonna tell anyone what actually happened over there?" Lena asked him once, voice low. Royce stared at the window. "Does it matter?" he said. Didn't matter before. She didn't argue, but deep down, she hated how right he was. The next morning, 2 officers from the Department of Defense showed up in the lobby. Not reporters. Not politicians. Not influencers. Real military brass. Full dress uniforms. One had a briefcase. The other had lines in his face carved by decades of war and no patience for showboating. They didn't ask to speak with the mayor. They asked for Royce. When they stepped into his room, every nurse in the hallway slowed their walk. The older officer stepped forward, removed his hat, and stood at attention with a sharp salute. "Sergeant Whitaker," he said, voice tight, formal. "Permission to speak freely." Royce looked him over. Recognition flickered behind his eyes. "Sergeant Major Heller," he said, then nodded once. "Granted." That was all. No hugs. No breakdowns. Just 2 men who had once moved through places no one in that hospital could pronounce, acknowledging each other like time hadn't passed. Heller opened the briefcase. Inside was a sealed folder, weathered, military stamped, and still marked confidential. Eyes only. Inside that, the operation file for Sandwatch, a mission buried so deep it had never made it to public record, where Royce Whitaker had not just served, but commanded a small mobile rescue team tasked with extracting civilian hostages during a cartel weapon intercept. For lives saved. 1 teammate lost. Injuries sustained. Recognition denied, because the mission never officially existed. "You were never supposed to wear that medal in public," Heller said, half grinning. "But I get it. Couldn't leave it in a drawer either." Royce just smiled faintly and said, "Didn't wear it. Just kept it close." Lena listened from the far side of the room, trying to process that the same man who used to clean gum off her folding chairs once ran into enemy fire for people whose names he never got. After the officers left, something began to shift back at the community center. The town council, once so quick to dismiss Royce as just maintenance, scrambled to organize a formal recognition. Bryce, red-faced and desperate, tried to give a speech in Royce's honor. Royce never showed up to the podium. Instead, he sent Lena with a note that read, "Medals don't make you a soldier. Moments do. I already had mine." The community started calling him Sergeant Whitaker in hushed tones, not quite sure if they were allowed to, but needing to call him something with weight. Still, Royce didn't go around correcting people. He didn't bask. He didn't even change his routine. By the end of the 2nd week, he was back at the center, left arm still in a sling, slowly inspecting the hinges on the back emergency door that still didn't shut properly. "You should be home resting," Lena told him. "I rest when the doors close right," he said. She didn't argue, and neither did anyone else. What people didn't know, what they still hadn't earned, was the deeper layer behind Royce's silence. He hadn't hidden his service because he was modest. He hid it because the last time he let people know, all it brought him was noise. Politicians looking for a speech, journalists begging for a tragedy quote, old unit contacts asking him to speak on their behalf. But no one ever really listened. Not until the day his jacket got cut open and they realized the man who mopped their floors had once bled on foreign soil for names he couldn't remember. And again, right here, for the ones they all knew. The newspaper ran a front-page photo of him, slumped in a plastic hospital chair, hooked up to fluids, eyes closed, the medal placed neatly in his lap like it finally had permission to be seen. And yet the caption under the photo still got it wrong. Community hero steps up during local crisis. They didn't call him by name. They didn't say sergeant. They didn't mention what he gave up to keep others whole. But Royce never read the paper anyway. He just sat in his booth during the evenings, sipping stale coffee, writing in that same notebook he always carried, jotting down names, locations, patterns, not because he was paranoid, but because he had learned long ago, readiness isn't fear, it's memory. And he remembered everything. That's why when the mayor offered to rename the community center after him, he declined. Instead, he requested one thing: a new camera in the southeast hallway, installed properly this time, with no blind spots. Just in case someone else ever comes through the wrong door, he said. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about posture. Because even though the town was just catching up to who Royce Whitaker really was, he'd never stopped being him. Not when they ignored him, not when they mocked him, and certainly not now. And in the silence that followed the shooting, that truth finally started to settle in. Respect, long delayed, had finally come. But Royce? Royce had never been waiting for it. They called it a ceremony, but Royce never stood on that stage, never gave a speech, never held a microphone. Not once. He stood off to the side beneath the shade of a sycamore tree, jacket buttoned even in the heat, shoulders still healing beneath layers of denim and scar tissue, watching as a town tried to apologize with folded chairs and printed programs. They named the North Hall after him, Whitaker Hall, and unveiled a plaque that read, "To the man who saw danger first and ran toward it anyway." Royce didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just nodded once when they asked if it was spelled right. It had been 2 months since the shooting, but the tremors of what happened hadn't stopped. Children who had once raced past him without a glance now paused and offered shy thank yous. Veterans he'd never met showed up just to shake his hand, some with medals of their own, some without, but all of them saw him now. Even Bryce, pale-faced and humbler than anyone had ever seen him, approached Royce during cleanup. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, eyes lowered. Royce didn't answer right away. He looked at the young man, studied him, then asked softly, "You still watching those combat videos?" Bryce hesitated. "Not lately." Royce handed him a folded paper. "Try reading this instead," he said. It was a checklist of building vulnerabilities. Every corner Royce had been watching for years. Bryce took it like it was a relic. Royce didn't need revenge. What he wanted was understanding. Quiet correction. Honest change. Later that day, Lena invited him to speak at a youth group event. "Just a few words," she said. "They look up to you now." Royce sat for a long time before answering. "They shouldn't look up to me," he said. "They should look around. That's where it matters." Still, he came, sat at the back of the room while others talked. Then, just before it ended, one of the kids, a 12-year-old named Miles, raised his hand and asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone you were a soldier?" Royce thought for a moment. Then he said, "Because medals don't raise alarms. Situational awareness does." The adults chuckled. The kids didn't. They just nodded like they understood. Something had shifted in them too. A few weeks later, a black SUV pulled into the community center lot. This time, it wasn't local police or state officials. It was a decorated brigadier general from Fort Myer. Uniform pressed, driver at attention, the kind of presence that made people freeze mid-conversation. He entered the building quietly, walked past the front desk, and asked, "Where can I find Sergeant Royce Whitaker?" Everyone pointed toward the gym. The general didn't flinch. He walked through the double doors, past rows of people, and stopped at the janitor's closet, where Royce was repairing a broken supply hinge. The general didn't ask Royce to stand. Instead, he stood at attention himself and said, "I never got the chance to thank you. Not for Sandwatch, and not for what you did here." Royce didn't miss a beat. "You don't salute janitors, sir," the general replied. "I do when they outrank most of the men I've served with." The room fell silent. A moment later, the general pulled out a small box, not flashy, not filmed, just handed over with both hands. Inside was a second Bronze Star. "We filed it." Quietly. "This one's official," he said. Royce took it. Didn't open it. Just nodded. "Don't need a duplicate," he murmured. "But I'll hold on to it. For whoever watches next." That afternoon, a new sign appeared on Royce's old locker. It read, "Field Office, Whitaker." No one touched his notebook anymore, but they all knew what it meant. Every staff member was trained on the checklist. Every exit resecured. Every blind spot reinforced. Not because a manual told them to, but because a man they'd ignored for years showed them how to really see. When Royce finally decided to retire, quietly, without notice, no speeches, he left behind only 3 things: his mop, his notebook, and his jacket, folded neatly and left on the bench outside the camera room. Inside the pocket, tucked beneath the old medal, was a note. "You don't need to tell people who you were. Show them who you are. That'll last longer." The notebook was sealed in a glass case beside the gym entrance, not for display, but for training. Every new hire was told to read it cover to cover. Not as policy, as preparation. Months passed. Then one morning, as spring broke across the town, a young woman opened the center for her first shift. She stopped at the door, stood at attention, and saluted before walking in. No one told her to do it. She'd just heard the stories about the man who once mopped that hallway but never missed a single door. About how he saved lives not with weapons, but with watchfulness. About how he was called a liar until truth exploded in their hands. Royce Whitaker was never famous. He never went viral. But the people in that town, they knew. And they told the story every year. On the anniversary of the day, someone brought a gun to their doorstep, and the janitor with the fake medal shielded them all.